Trucks crossing the U.S.-Canada border through BC to Alaska could be facing extra fees in the future. While Premier David Eby has mentioned the idea before, this time he's taking serious action. The province will be tabling a new law that allows the government to take strong countermeasures in response to U.S. tariffs.
The quiet neighbor to the north just blindsided the U.S. in the war they got forced into. See, instead of lobbing tariffs back at Donald Trump, British Columbia's premier chose a more shocking move: choke off an entire state's supply line with a single toll. If you think that sounds extreme, wait until you hear how much freight companies say this will cost Alaskans. They are talking about thousands of dollars in extra fees per load, and for a place already facing some of the highest living expenses in North America, that could be devastating. But what about you? Could this move drive up prices on everyday essentials, from groceries to fuel, across North America? Stick around, because when a nation decides to weaponize geography, we are all at risk, and you deserve to know why. Alaska's geography, America's hidden weakness. When you look at the geography of Alaska, it seems like a fortress of American independence. Towering mountains, sprawling wilderness, and boundless natural resources make it look impenetrable, but the truth is far more fragile. Alaska is not physically connected to the continental United States. The only way to move goods, fuel, and supplies between Alaska and the rest of America is by crossing Canadian territory. For decades, this geographic dependency had been a quiet fact of life, tucked away in trade logistics and ignored by political leaders. But Premier David Eby's toll proposal exposed what policy experts had warned about for years: Alaska's complete reliance on Canadian infrastructure. Every truck carrying fresh produce to Anchorage, every shipment of fuel headed to Fairbanks, every piece of construction material bound for Juneau must pass through British Columbia and Yukon Territory. Maritime shipping routes hug the Canadian coastline, passing through Canadian-controlled waters. Even commercial airliners and cargo planes depend on Canadian airspace to connect Alaska with the lower 48 states. This is not just a symbolic connection, it is structural. There are only two American states not part of the contiguous mainland, Hawaii and Alaska. But while Hawaii is surrounded by ocean, Alaska is geographically cornered. Its overland routes are entirely at the mercy of Canada's goodwill. That vulnerability has now become a bargaining chip in an international trade war. Premier Eby understood that geography can be a weapon, and with Donald Trump escalating tariffs on Canadian exports, Eby decided to expose the soft underbelly of American logistics. The proposed tolls weren't about revenue, they were about leverage. For Alaska, the threat of those tolls was a wake-up call. Suddenly, the state's access to groceries, fuel, and basic necessities was at risk. Not because of storms or supply chain hiccups, but because of political conflict. But the battle lines weren't just being drawn on the roads and in the forest. They stretched all the way back to a treaty written nearly 50 years ago. But before I get into the details of this treaty, hit that subscribe button. It is really easy, but it really helps us creators a lot. Thanks. Treaty Trump wants to tear up. A forgotten Cold War treaty has suddenly become the only thing standing between Alaska and economic isolation. Signed in the year 1977, the Alaska Highway Treaty was a product of post-war cooperation between Canada and the United States. Its terms were simple but powerful. Canada would not impose any tolls or fees on the Alaska Highway when used for transporting goods. In exchange, the United States would continue to fund its maintenance and infrastructure upgrades. This treaty remained an uncontroversial footnote in diplomatic history. It symbolized stability and goodwill between two allied nations. But when Premier Eby announced his toll proposal, the treaty suddenly became the legal battleground. Eby's proposal threatened to override this agreement, arguing that the new tolls would apply only to additional segments of highway infrastructure, not directly covered by the treaty's original terms. His position was clear: if Washington could sidestep trade agreements with tariffs, then British Columbia could test the limits of its own obligations. President Donald Trump, however, was having none of it. Standing at the White House podium, he thundered that the treaty was crystal clear and that Canada had no right to impose tolls on American truckers. His legal advisors began preparing retaliatory measures, threatening to freeze cross-border infrastructure funds and review every other treaty with Canada for leverage. What began as a technical dispute over tariffs had now escalated into an international legal standoff. Trump's team accused British Columbia of violating both the Alaska Highway Treaty and broader trade protections under the North American Free Trade Agreement replacement. Canadian officials, meanwhile, argued that they were acting within their rights to protect provincial interests. But behind the legal arguments and treaty clauses, something far more combustible was fueling this crisis. It wasn't about the wording on a piece of paper. It was about the people now fighting over it. The ego war. David Eby versus Donald Trump. The Alaska toll standoff was never just about economics or treaties. At its core, it had become a war of egos between two men who refused to back down. On one side stood Donald Trump, the combative, zero-sum president of the United States, determined to prove that America would not be strong-armed by a foreign province. On the other, David Eby, a rising political force in Canada, determined to defend his province's dignity against American aggression. Trump, known for turning every policy dispute into a personal vendetta, blasted Eby by name during a rally in Anchorage. He called him a weak provincial bureaucrat trying to shake down America. Eby, in response, stood at a press conference in Victoria and declared, "British Columbia will not be bullied. We will defend our rights, our economy, and our dignity." What began as a trade disagreement had spiraled into symbolic warfare. Trump's tariffs on Canadian steel, lumber, and dairy had triggered the toll proposal. But now neither leader was fighting over timber or cheese. They were fighting over pride and political power. Every insult exchanged, every retaliatory policy announced, every media headline fanned the flames. And for the border communities caught in the middle, this wasn't political theater, it was survival. Towns like Hyder, Skagway, and Haines suddenly found themselves at the center of an international showdown that threatened their way of life. The clash between Eby and Trump was no longer about trade. It was about national pride, political vengeance, and the dangerous consequences when leaders turn economic disputes into personal battles. But as their standoff escalated, it would soon drag in forces far beyond British Columbia or Washington. The next chapter in this crisis would not be written in a courtroom, but in the lives of everyday Alaskans and Canadians whose futures now hung in the balance. The land lockdown, Canada's power play. With a single announcement, Canada could trap an entire American state. That is the stark reality now facing Alaska, as the political standoff between Ottawa, Victoria, and Washington spirals into something far more dangerous. What began as a tariff skirmish is now morphing into an all-out logistics war, and Alaska is at the epicenter. At the heart of Canada's strategy is a chillingly simple move: a land lockdown. By imposing targeted tolls, inspections, and regulatory bottlenecks, or in the extreme case, outright closure, British Columbia and Yukon Territory could choke off Alaska's only overland lifeline. For most Americans, the very idea sounds impossible. How can one province in Canada control access to an American state? But the geography tells a different story. Nearly 80% of the Alaska Highway, the singular road artery connecting the continental United States to Alaska, lies within Canadian territory. That route is the thread holding Alaska's economy together. Without it, trucks hauling fuel, groceries, and construction materials would have nowhere to go. No alternative roads, no quick detours, just thousands of miles of rugged wilderness and icy sea. Premier David Eby has already fired the warning shot with his toll proposal. But that is just one weapon in Canada's arsenal. Beyond tolls, British Columbia and Yukon can use customs inspections, weight restrictions, or road maintenance delays to strangle trade flows. They could cite environmental concerns, public safety, or infrastructure repairs as reasons to slow cross-border movement. And if tensions escalate further, a total shutdown of the highway is within their power. The consequences would be catastrophic. Freight costs would skyrocket. Essential goods would run short. Small businesses would buckle under the burden of higher prices and delays. Alaska's economy would grind to a halt, not because of natural disaster or market collapse, but because of a political decision made thousands of miles away. But the threat to Alaska's economy does not end at the border. It stretches across ocean waters that are just as vulnerable and just as essential. The ocean trap: why Canada controls Alaska's lifeline. While the Alaska Highway captures most of the headlines, it is not the only artery linking Alaska to the outside world. In fact, it is not even the busiest. More than 90% of Alaska's goods move not by land, but by sea. And those waters, they are largely under Canadian control. Nestled along the Pacific coastline, the Inside Passage is one of North America's most vital maritime corridors. Winding through British Columbia's fjords and islands, it provides a calm, sheltered route for freighters, ferries, and cruise ships traveling between the continental United States and Alaska. This passage is more than scenic. It is strategic. It protects vessels from the punishing swells of the open ocean and dramatically reduces travel time and fuel costs. But now, this tranquil waterway has become the next front in Canada's retaliation strategy. By imposing new fees, permits, or environmental regulations on ships passing through Canadian waters, British Columbia can make Alaska's maritime supply chain painfully expensive and unpredictable. In theory, Canada could even restrict or deny access entirely, forcing vessels to brave the dangerous Pacific routes or halt operations altogether. For Alaska's tourism industry, the stakes could not be higher. In the year 2023 alone, more than 1,600,000 cruise passengers sailed through the Inside Passage to visit Southeast Alaska. If Canada clamps down, the entire cruise season could collapse, devastating local economies in Juneau, Ketchikan, and Sitka. The freight industry would fare no better. Ports in Anchorage and Fairbanks rely on regular shipments of food, fuel, and industrial goods, arriving via Canadian waters. Any disruption would ripple through grocery stores, gas stations, and construction sites across the state. And it is not just about commerce. Ferry terminals in places like Prince Rupert serve as crucial transit points for Alaskans traveling south. A Canadian blockade would slam the door on those routes, cutting off families, students, and workers from the mainland. The message from British Columbia is clear. If the United States tries to squeeze Canada with tariffs, Canada can squeeze back harder. One toll, one permit, one closed port at a time. But the leverage does not end on the roads or in the water. It extends to the very skies above Alaska. The skies closing in. Overflight rights as a weapon. What happens when Canada shuts the sky? Alaska's lifeline could be grounded overnight. For decades, North American air travel has relied on an unspoken agreement of cooperation. Commercial and cargo flights between Alaska and the lower 48 states routinely cross Canadian airspace without issue, thanks to long-standing overflight permissions. These arrangements keep passenger tickets affordable, cargo deliveries timely, and military operations coordinated. But just like the land routes and maritime passages, Canadian airspace is not an unchangeable guarantee. It is a privilege, and one that can be revoked. If tensions between Canada and the United States escalate further, the Canadian government could use overflight rights as yet another pressure point. By imposing additional fees, new permit requirements, or even outright denial of passage, Canada could force American airlines to reroute around Canadian territory. The consequences would be immediate. Passenger flights would face longer, more expensive journeys over the Pacific or Arctic, increasing fuel costs and travel times. Freight carriers would be forced to adjust logistics, reducing cargo capacity and delaying essential deliveries. For remote communities in Alaska, already facing high prices and limited access, the impact would be crushing. Military operations would not be spared either. Alaska is home to critical United States defense infrastructure. Any disruption of overflight agreements would trigger alarm bells at the Pentagon, complicating joint exercises, emergency evacuations, and supply missions. To be clear, Canada has not yet threatened to close its skies. Doing so would risk significant diplomatic fallout. But the threat now hangs in the air, quiet but very real. And for the communities living along the border, these geopolitical maneuvers are not abstract policy debates. They are existential threats to daily life. Because behind every toll, every permit, every airspace regulation are people whose livelihoods depend on the free flow of goods and movement. And now those people find themselves on the front lines of a trade war they never asked for. The hidden victims, how small towns became bargaining chips for thousands living along the United States-Canada border. This standoff is not about tariffs, treaties, or political posturing. It is about survival. Small towns like Hyder, Skagway, and Haines have become the unintentional victims of a geopolitical feud that has nothing to do with them. Their economies, their supply chains, and their very way of life are now bargaining chips in a transcontinental power struggle. Take Hyder, for example, a tiny Alaskan town with fewer than 100 residents. Hyder is so isolated that the only way in or out by road is through Stewart, British Columbia. Residents rely on Canadian roads, Canadian cell towers, and even Canadian emergency services. If British Columbia follows through on toll threats, or worse, imposes a land lockdown, Hyder would effectively be cut off from the rest of the world. In Skagway and Haines, the story is no less dire. These communities depend on seamless cross-border trade and tourism to survive. Cruise ships bring thousands of visitors every year, many traveling through Canadian waters. Local stores stock their shelves with goods shipped overland via the Alaska Highway. Any disruption, Whether a toll, a permit delay, or an overflight restriction ripples through these towns instantly. Already, residents are feeling the strain. Fuel prices are climbing, grocery shipments are delayed. Tourism operators are reporting cancellations as travelers fear escalating border tensions. Local governments have written joint letters to Ottawa and Washington, pleading for calm and de-escalation. But those letters are being drowned out by the louder voices of political brinkmanship. For the people of these border communities, the standoff between President Donald Trump and Premier David Eby is not a political game. It is a slow-motion economic disaster unfolding in real time. They are stocking up on essential, canceling business plans, and bracing for the next announcement. Because when your grocery prices, your fuel supply, and even your family's ability to visit a doctor depend on a border that is now a battleground, every toll and tariff becomes personal. And as the blockade strategy tightens, the question is no longer whether these towns will suffer. It is how much. And that is what I am going to talk about right now, because this how prices could skyrocket in ways no one expected. But did you subscribe or did you forget? Just do it, I will wait for you. Thanks. The economic bombshell on Alaska. If this blockade happens, Alaskan families will pay the price, literally. The standoff brewing between Canada and the United States is not an abstract trade war fought in courtrooms and press conferences. It is about to hit the dinner tables, gas stations, and pharmacies of everyday Alaskans. Behind every political maneuver, the economic reality is beginning to unfold, and the consequences will be brutal. Alaska is a state that already wrestles with some of the highest living costs in North America. Groceries, fuel, medicine, and construction materials are all more expensive here, not because of market forces, but because of distance and dependence. Everything that sustains Alaskan life is hauled across thousands of miles, much of it passing through Canadian territory. Now, with British Columbia threatening to slap tolls on trucks and restrict access to key routes, those fragile supply chains face an unprecedented strain. If the tolls are imposed, shipping companies will not absorb the added costs. They will pass them directly to consumers. Each truckload of produce could cost several $1,000s more. Every gallon of fuel will climb in price. Construction projects will face material shortages and skyrocketing expenses. And it is not only the big-ticket items that will be affected. Even basic essentials like milk, bread, and prescription drugs will become harder to afford. Industry experts warn that the increase in transportation costs could push Alaskan inflation to crisis levels. In remote communities like Fairbanks and Juneau, where food and fuel already cost significantly more than in the lower 48 states, the blockade's impact would be devastating. For families living paycheck to paycheck, the difference between a stocked pantry and an empty one could soon depend on the decisions made in Victoria and Washington. The ripple effect will not stop at Alaska's borders. Neighboring Canadian communities that rely on cross-border trade will feel the economic aftershocks. But the most immediate victims will be Alaskan families forced to choose between heating their homes and feeding their children. And while prices spiral, another cost is mounting, a cost measured not in dollars, but in trust. The diplomatic breakdown. How alliances are unraveling. This is not just about Alaska anymore. It is tearing apart United States-Canada relations. What began as a trade skirmish has evolved into a full-scale diplomatic breakdown, threatening decades of cooperation between the two nations. For nearly 2 centuries, the northern border has stood as a symbol of peace and partnership. It is the longest undefended border in the world, a testament to mutual respect and shared values. But today, that foundation is crumbling under the weight of political egos and economic retaliation. British Columbia's toll threat and Canada's broader blockade strategy have already shattered the quiet, neighborly understanding that once defined this relationship. Washington's response has been equally aggressive. President Donald Trump's administration has begun freezing infrastructure cooperation funds, reviewing cross-border treaties, and preparing new rounds of tariffs. Behind closed doors, diplomats are scrambling to contain the fallout. United States and Canadian trade representatives who once worked together seamlessly are now locked in tense negotiations. Long-standing agreements on customs preclearance, transportation corridors, and joint border security are being reconsidered. The spirit of collaboration that once ensured smooth trade and travel is unraveling, replaced by suspicion and brinkmanship. The breakdown is not just economic, it is personal. Leaders on both sides have turned this dispute into a contest of wills. Trump's public insults against Premier David Eby and Canada's defiant responses have poisoned the atmosphere for dialogue. Every new policy announcement feels less like diplomacy and more like a declaration of war. For ordinary citizens who cross the border daily for work, family, or commerce, the erosion of trust is palpable. And as the political hostility deepens, both nations are preparing for the next stage of escalation, one that could drag this conflict into dangerous new territory: the trade war spiral. What happens when Trump strikes back? President Donald Trump is not known for backing down. And now he is preparing a legal and economic counterattack that could deepen the crisis. The playbook is familiar. When challenged, Trump escalates. This time he is ready to strike back with a series of measures designed to punish Canada and reassert American dominance. Top of the list is the revocation of trade exemptions that benefit Canadian ports and industries. Trump's advisors have already drafted proposals to eliminate special tariffs and preferential access agreements that allow Canadian goods to flow easily into American markets. Ports in Vancouver, Prince Rupert, and Halifax could soon face new duties and fees, making it harder and more expensive for Canadian exporters to compete. Alongside this, the Trump administration is moving to freeze cross-border infrastructure cooperation. Joint projects to modernize border crossings, highways, and railway connections are being suspended. This will not only disrupt trade, it will also create logistical headaches for both nations, further straining already fragile supply chains. The legal front is just as aggressive. Trump's lawyers are preparing to challenge British Columbia's toll plan in international courts, arguing that it violates the 1977 Alaska Highway Treaty and broader trade agreements. The White House has even hinted at reviewing the North American Free Trade Agreement replacement terms to find additional leverage points against Canada. But these retaliatory measures come with their own risks. Every action taken by Washington invites an equal and opposite reaction from Ottawa and Victoria. The trade war spiral threatens to drag both nations into an economic quagmire with no clear exit. And while political leaders trade blows, the people caught in the middle, the workers who keep the economy running, are the ones who will pay the ultimate price, the workers forgotten in the crossfire. Behind the headlines are workers and families who could lose everything. As the trade war escalates and the blockade strategy tightens, the human cost is becoming impossible to ignore. In Alaska, the trucking industry is on the front lines. Thousands of drivers, mechanics, and logistics workers depend on the smooth flow of goods across Canadian territory. British Columbia's tolls and regulatory bottlenecks threaten to choke their livelihoods. Smaller trucking companies, already operating on thin margins, face bankruptcy. Drivers could lose their jobs. Entire communities built around the trucking economy may crumble. It is not just truckers who stand to lose. Alaskan businesses that rely on imported goods, grocery stores, construction firms, fuel distributors, will struggle to stay afloat. Layoffs will ripple through the state's economy. Families will face rising unemployment and shrinking paychecks, even as the cost of living continues to climb. Canadian workers are also in the crosshairs. Ports in British Columbia depend heavily on cross-border commerce. New tariffs and trade restrictions threaten jobs in shipping, customs, and logistics. Communities in Prince Rupert and Vancouver, already grappling with economic uncertainty, will feel the sting of lost business and falling revenues. The collateral damage does not stop there. Tourism operators in both countries are bracing for canceled trips and dwindling visitors as border tensions rise. Hotel workers, restaurant staff, tour guides, people with no stake in international politics, will see their livelihoods evaporate. Yet, amid all this chaos, the voices of these workers are being drowned out by political grandstanding. The clash between President Donald Trump and Premier David Eby has turned ordinary people into pawns in a game they never asked to play. And as the blockade strategy and trade war spiral continue, the question remains: How much more will these forgotten workers be forced to sacrifice before the politicians decide to stop? The answer may come in the next phase of this crisis, one where the fallout reaches far beyond Alaska's borders, the collapse of North American free trade norms. If Alaska's access can be weaponized, what trade deal is safe? That is the unsettling question now rippling through boardrooms, policy circles, and global markets. The toll threats, highway lockdowns, and maritime restrictions that once seemed like political theater have exposed something far deeper, a fundamental fragility at the heart of North American trade. For decades, free trade between Canada, the United States, and Mexico has been upheld by an unspoken rule. No matter how bitter the political disputes, economic cooperation must continue. That principle gave birth to agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement and its successor, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. It was the invisible glue that kept supply chains moving, borders open, and economies growing. But the standoff over Alaska has shattered that assumption. When British Columbia's Premier David Eby moved to toll American trucks and threaten Alaska's supply routes, it was not just an act of retaliation. It was a declaration that geography itself could be used as an economic weapon. And when President Donald Trump responded with threats to freeze infrastructure funds and tear up cross-border treaties, the message was equally clear. No agreement is sacred when politics get personal. The fallout has already begun. Freight companies, port authorities, and trade organizations across the continent are sounding the alarm. If Canada can unilaterally choke off Alaska's access in response to tariffs, what is to stop future disputes from targeting other trade corridors? Could Mexico block agricultural shipments to Texas? Could American railroads be used to retaliate against Canadian oil exports? The unwritten rules of North American free trade are collapsing in real time. And as the standoff between Trump and Eby escalates, it is sending a message that will reverberate far beyond the borders of Alaska, the geopolitical domino effect. When two allies go to war, the entire world watches and reacts. The escalating trade war between Canada and the United States is no longer a bilateral dispute. It is a geopolitical domino effect with consequences stretching across oceans. European Union trade officials have already voiced concern. If the world's closest trading partners can weaponize geography and infrastructure, how safe are the treaties underpinning Europe's own fragile economic alliances? Leaders in Brussels fear this conflict could embolden nationalist governments in Hungary, Poland, or Italy to disrupt trade routes within Europe. In the Asia-Pacific region, the ripple effects are just as stark. Countries like Japan, South Korea, and Australia depend heavily on stable North American markets. They see the Alaska blockade not as an isolated incident, but as a dangerous precedent. If the United States and Canada can undermine free trade over a tariff dispute, it signals that no alliance is immune from collapse. China, meanwhile, is watching with interest and opportunity. As Washington and Ottawa trade blows, Beijing sees an opening to deepen its own trade partnerships. Canadian exporters squeezed by American tariffs may turn to Chinese markets. American companies hurt by Canadian retaliation may seek Chinese suppliers. In a world where trade corridors are closing, China's Belt and Road Initiative looks increasingly attractive. The global shockwave does not stop there. Multinational corporations are reassessing their supply chains. Insurance costs for cross-border shipments are rising. Investment in North American infrastructure is slowing. And behind every diplomatic memo and economic forecast is the unsettling reality. If Canada and the United States cannot keep the peace, what hope is there for global trade stability? But the consequences of this standoff are not confined to boardrooms and embassies. They are creeping into the daily lives of millions of people on both sides of the border. The consumer cost, why you'll feel this at the grocery store. You may never visit Alaska, but this standoff could hit your wallet tomorrow. The battle over Alaska's supply routes is not an abstract geopolitical chess match. It is a slow-motion economic disaster that is already making life more expensive for ordinary Americans and Canadians. When British Columbia proposed tolls on trucks carrying goods to Alaska, freight companies warned of price hikes. Those warnings were not exaggerations. Every additional fee, delay, or regulatory hurdle increases the cost of transportation, and those costs do not stay in the trucking industry. They end up in your grocery bill, your fuel prices, and your construction expenses. Produce shipped from the lower 48 states to Alaska now faces thousands of dollars in additional costs per truckload. Fuel prices in Anchorage and Fairbanks have already started creeping up. Construction projects dependent on materials shipped through Canadian ports are being delayed or canceled, and the ripple effect is spreading south. Ports in Seattle and Tacoma are seeing fewer Alaskan-bound shipments. Freight rail lines in Montana and North Dakota are reporting backlogs. Grocery stores in border towns from Maine to Michigan are preparing for higher prices as suppliers absorb the shock of disrupted trade routes. Even Canadian consumers are feeling the squeeze. As trade tensions escalate, American tariffs on Canadian goods are driving up prices on everything from lumber to dairy. Canadian businesses that depend on cross-border commerce are facing uncertainty, passing on their costs to consumers. This is the hidden cost of economic warfare. It is not paid by politicians or corporate executives. It is paid by families trying to buy groceries, heat their homes, or build a new deck. The Alaska blockade may have started as a symbolic gesture, but its consequences are all too real, and they are landing squarely on the shoulders of everyday people. And yet, the question that now looms largest is not about prices or politics. It is about how this standoff will end, and whether either side is willing to blink. The Alaska gamble. Will Trump or EB blink first? One wrong move now could define the United States-Canada relationship for a generation. That is the high-stakes gamble unfolding between President Donald Trump and Premier David Eby. Both leaders have staked their political reputations on winning this fight. Neither has shown any interest in compromise. For Trump, backing down would mean appearing weak to his base. His America First agenda has always relied on projecting strength, on tariffs, border security, and economic dominance. To concede to a Canadian province would be unthinkable. For Eby, yielding would be political suicide. He has positioned himself as the defender of Canadian dignity against American aggression. In British Columbia, his tough stance has won him praise from voters tired of being treated like a junior partner in North American trade. But as the standoff drags on, the costs are mounting, and not just economically. Diplomats in Ottawa and Washington warn that this dispute is poisoning the broader relationship between two of the world's closest allies. Trust is eroding. Cross-border infrastructure projects are being shelved. Military cooperation is being quietly reevaluated. Behind closed doors, negotiators are searching for an off-ramp. Some suggest a temporary suspension of tariffs in exchange for British Columbia shelving the toll proposal. Others propose a new bilateral commission to address the legal dispute over the Alaska Highway Treaty. But the window for compromise is closing. Every day the blockade strategy remains on the table, the harder it becomes for either Trump or Eby to back down without appearing defeated. And the longer this continues, the greater the risk that this trade war will not end with a handshake, but with long-term damage to the fabric of North American cooperation. And that is a huge deal. But what's your take on this dangerous back and forth between two superpowers? Let's talk in the comments. Thanks for watching.